Thanks a lot, Jeremy. And thanks everyone for taking the time to come and listen to our talk. Today I'm going to be talking about ecosystem services related to giant kelp forests that are found in the Falkland Islands. And this is a project that's been run through the South Atlantic Environment Research Institute, which is based down in the Falklands. And we're just going to run through some of the services that I've looked at over the last few months of doing this work, and kind of the numbers that have come out from this work. So in the UK, we have 14 overseas territories in total around the world. And in the South Atlantic Ocean region, there's 5 separate areas. You've got St. Helena, Ascension, and Tristan da Cunha, this kind of one administrative group that's in the center here. And then further down south in the colder areas, you've got the South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, and then the Falkland Islands, which are just off the tip of Argentina and Chile on the continental shelf. And so this is the area that I'm going to be talking about today. So the Falklands are an archipelago, so made up of a number of islands. They have 2 main island areas. So you've got the East and West Falklands, and then smaller islands scattered around that central area. And they're in the western side of it, it's a sort of temperate environment. And then over to the east, you've got a slightly colder subpolar environment as it's getting a bit closer to the Antarctic region. And when you think of the Falklands, you probably think of charismatic animals such as the penguins, seabirds such as albatross, a lot of sheep, which weren't there originally, and then the large marine mammals such as the elephant seals and whales, dolphins, things like that. So there's a lot of life that's based around this quite productive region. And SARI, the South Atlantic Environment Research Institute, is based in the capital, Stanley, so where the yellow star is. And we do research, right up from the Caribbean, so tropical area, right down to the very icy Antarctic. And we look at areas relating to marine, terrestrial, physical, and the data that sort of puts all these areas together so that we can do sort of the analysis such as this. And so the area of the Falklands land is around 12,000 kilometers squared, so fairly sizable. And it's very sparsely populated, so around 3,000 people live there, mostly in the capital of Stanley, so they're all sort of focused around this area here. And so while we have these charismatic seabirds and marine mammals, we also have, I suppose, the dominant ecosystem or biome that you have is these cold water kelp systems that surround the whole of the Falklands, as well as up into South America, Patagonian region. And these are really important systems, which are sort of a structuring ecosystem, which are home to many other species. So quite an abundant amount of fisheries, invertebrates, as well as these mammals and seabirds that all interact with this system. And so there's a lot of services that we can gain from this area. And so these come in both direct and indirect services that we get. And so direct ones are things like fishing, ecotourism, and extraction of the kelp itself can be a useful resource. And we also have indirect services, so things like attenuating wave action, coastal protection, fixing carbon, so drawing down carbon and storing it within their biomass, cycling nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus from the seawater into their biomass to feed as useful feed for other animals. And then the associated biodiversity, the research that's involved within these areas, and recreation such as scuba diving and kayaking around these kind of areas. And I'm going to touch on a few of these areas for the Falklands where we had data available to investigate them fully. And so with all of these kind of assessments, one of the main initial stages is figuring out where we find the kelp system, so how far it extends, and how dense it is around the Falklands. And I suppose that, yeah, the trick with this initially is that when you're looking out, from the coast, looking out onto the sea, normally all you see is these kind of areas of rafting kelp which floats on the surface. So it's difficult to fully encapsulate where the kelp is distributed. However, when you get up into the sky and you get a bird's eye view, it's actually relatively easy to differentiate between where you have these thick rafting areas of kelp that float on the surface, so this darker area that I've highlighted here, or the area around it which isn't kelp, which is kind of these like lighter bluer areas. And so we can use remote sensing to delineate where we have these surface touching kelp and apply that to the whole of the Falklands. And so this initial stage, using inputs from satellite technologies such as Sentinel-1 and 2, Landsat 8, and topographic monitoring, and then in situ validation points. So divers going into the water, seeing where you have kelp, putting that on the map, and then seeing where we have particular instances of kelp or whether it's something else, and then using that to map where we have the distribution of kelp. And so this was part of a larger DEFRA-funded project which mapped not only the sea but also the land. And so we have a number of different categories, but what I'm showing on the map in the green is just where we have this Macrocystis, so the largest type of kelp, where that's distributed in the Falklands. And so that total area comes to around something like 830 kilometers squared. So a fairly sizable amount of this kelp system. And within this mapped area of kelp, we also wanted to know how densely packed it was with kelp. So it might be, loads and loads of individual kelp strands coming up from the seabed, or it might be very sparsely populated. And so we did some, we've been doing surveys in the Falklands annually for quite some years. And so we've just averaged over around a 10-year period of the average density, accounting for seasonal variation. So throughout the year you get growth periods where it's producing much more abundant amount of kelp, and then in the winter periods where it gets more sparse and raggedy, so it sort of wears away into the winter and goes through these sort of annual cycles. And so using that together with the distribution, we have this idea of where they are and how many there are in a certain area. And so just conceptually, you have this sort of mix of these larger Macrocystis kelp, which is the really large kelp species. For those of you in Europe, you might know kelp species Lawsonia, which exists around areas like the UK and off of Europe. And so you've got I suppose around 1 meter tall, something like that. So quite small relative to these, which can be 10, 20, 13 meters tall, quite distinctly bigger species. But we also have smaller species within this larger one. So we have these Lawsonia species, the two different species that are kind of an understory within the kelp as well. And then you have all the different species that are within that. So now we have this sort of idea of how dense it is and what we have. And so the first service that we can apply this knowledge to is carbon fixation and sequestration within the biomass of the kelp. So this is a kind of concept called blue carbon. So any biomass that stores carbon that's in the coastal realm is known as blue carbon. And this can be things like seagrass, salt marsh, or mangroves. Those are the sort of traditional ones that people picture when you're talking about blue carbon. And these are really significant amounts of carbon that are drawn down into these systems and stored either in their biomass, like their woody structure, for instance, or as they break down, stored in the soil and sediment around them. And so the key is like being able to store them for a significant amount of time. So it can be over sort of decades or a century kind of period. And they have a significant amount more carbon stored than terrestrial systems. So, you know, often people think about forests as a, you know, the key to carbon sequestration, but perhaps it should be more shifted towards these blue carbon, which store many times more carbon in their surrounding sediment. And for a period, kelp or macroalgae generally wasn't included within this blue carbon group because they often grow on rocky areas or hard sediment bedrock, and so they don't have this sort of sediment immediately surrounding them typically. But more recent research has found that there is actually a significant pathway down to deep sea sediments surrounding these systems, so off the continental shelf or into deeper areas which have these sediments beyond the mixing layer. And so they, even though it's a small percent, around 10% of the total net primary productivity of that system, it can be significant over areas that are large, like the kelp of the Falklands. And so these pathways essentially, you get a very small amount stored within the shelf. So it might be buried in a sort of shallow layer or in troughs that are on that shallow shelf system. But the more significant amount is drawn down through particular organic carbon or dissolved organic carbon in the water, and drifts down and past the mixing layer, so stops getting recirculated and eaten by animals, and it drifts down to deep sea and is buried for significant periods. And so surrounding the Falklands, we had, off the continental shelf, you have these very deep areas, which could contribute to this kind of sequestration potential. And on a global scale, it's estimated there's around 173 teragrams of carbon, or over 600 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year that's stored in these kind of routes. And so it's kind of a significant amount that's been underappreciated until more recently. So within our assessment, the first stage we looked at was looking at how much carbon was stored typically within these Macrocystis and Lawsonia whole plants. So the structure of a kelp species, typically you have this holdfast that holds it onto the rock. You have these tough stipes that come up a bit like a tree trunk. You have these pneumatocysts, which are the sort of gas bladders that hold it up, so it does form these sort of rafting areas. And then the lamina, so kind of the leaves or fronds that drift out over it. And so each of these have different amounts of carbon that's stored within them. And they form different heights as well. So the Lawsonia is a little bit smaller and a slightly different structure than this Macrocystis that I'm showing. But we averaged out the typical density, as I mentioned before, the dry weight, so how much essentially an individual kelp colony weighs by itself, and then the carbon weight, so how much carbon is typically stored within that dry weight. And when we apply that to the whole area that we've mapped, 830 square kilometers, we get this equivalent for carbon dioxide that's stored at its peak. So when it's fully grown at the peak of summer. But then we also have this sequestration, so the amount that's taken down into the deeper areas. And so when we were evaluating this, we're using standard values for the amount of net primary productivity for a kelp system. So not specific to the Falklands, but more of a general productivity number. And we're using the proportion that is on average taken into these different stages in the system. So as I mentioned, some is taken in particulate organic carbon, some is dissolved organic carbon, and some is, the stuff that's not stored is either rafted away, eaten by the animals, or just remineralized within in the shelf. And so a lot of it is, eaten and taken elsewhere, but then some of it is transported to this deep sea, and so it's around 10% of that total productivity. And when we apply that again to the total area that we've mapped, we get these annual values for the amount of carbon equivalent that's stored within that system. And so we've got a an average number of 0.29 teragrams million tons of carbon dioxide per year that's taken down, and then we've got some variation on either side, so maximum and minimum, to give a sort of confidence around it. And so it's a fairly significant amount that's a fair amount over the period. So even though it's a smaller than the actual standing stock, it's significant, more significant over a multi-year period. And so when we have this carbon value, so in terms of weight, we can also equate it to sort of a monetary value when we're doing these kind of assessments. In this case, we're equating it to traded and non-traded value of carbon on emissions trading schemes. So in this case, we've used the European Emission Trading Scheme. And so this is a system that's a sort of cap and trade system, which is trying to reduce and mitigate the effects of carbon emissions from various industries. And so these values are based on a number of assumptions and I guess present day valuations of what it might be worth. So the number today will be different to the number in the future. So we might have a target for the amount of emissions that we are looking, or target for the temperature that we want to reach, or not go past. In this case, 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, and then we make this prediction of how much carbon dioxide that would equate to, and therefore how much each ton of carbon dioxide emitted now will impact that target in the future. And we also make assumptions on whether it should be shifted to more expensive today or for future generations, so where the payment for those effects should lie. And that's I suppose collectively known as the social cost of carbon. So how is it going to affect people and to what extent, based on those predictions. And when I mentioned traded and non-traded, so traded is these industries such as power plants and emissions from the aviation industry. And then the non-traded, you have any other industry that produces carbon dioxide in a significant amount. So it might be from farming, transport sector, or houses. So many other industries which feed into that overall amount of carbon that's being emitted, and how we figure out that integrated assessment model of how we're going to reach our targets. And so in the present day, so a little bit convoluted there, but in the present day, you see these different traded and non-traded values, and you can equate those to the carbon dioxide that is stored. So the amount that we're helping reach this target essentially through nature-based solutions, such as having vast amounts of kelp which draw down that carbon. And you can see in the future these values kind of start matching each other. So they reach this point where you have a greater focus initially on these non-traded, but then as it increases, they become equal in their value in the future. So they're all towards reaching one goal, and you can see they rapidly go up through time in their costs. So the cost now, is relatively small relative to in 30 years time, when the problem is much more imminent. And so you've got this value, and you equate them in the present day for the standing stock. It's equivalent to 60 million pounds, and then 31 million pounds that's sequestered annually into the deep sea from this kelp system in its entirety. So the next service that we were investigating was nutrient cycling. So this is essentially the amount of stuff like nitrogen and phosphorus that is within the water that is absorbed by the kelp. So taking in these nitrates and nitrites, and essentially assimilated so that it can become a useful organic matter for either growth of the kelp itself, or for feeding the animals that rely on it for food, so that the fish that or invertebrates that feed on it. And so it sort of fixes or takes in this nitrogen that's floating around in the water and turns it into something else. And so this is really useful, obviously, for maintaining fisheries that are reliant on this area, as well as stopping excess nutrients from being available in the environments, that often cause sort of damaging effects. So, on coral reefs, for example, when you have an excess amount of nutrients in the water that aren't being absorbed within things like this, then you get excess overgrowth over that system. So excess nutrients, which are typically, you typically get excess nutrients these days around anywhere that's populated, because you tend to get a lot of sewage or runoff from land feeding out into the ocean. And so this is kind of a really useful service, more useful perhaps in areas that are heavily populated, but useful on a global scale nonetheless. And so in an assessment by Costanza et al. In 2014, they evaluated the contribution from macroalgae and seagrasses on a global scale, evaluated to around $289 US dollars per kilometer squared per year, in terms of that nutrient cycling service. And so we did a fairly straightforward equivalence for that in terms of the area that we have for the Falklands in terms of the mapped macroalgae. And then, so moving away from indirect services, we also mapped some of the direct services, so equivalent to the commercial fisheries that are associated with the kelp. And so there's a number of commercial species within the Falklands. So you can sort of just see them in the table here, coming down the side. And this is fairly valuable industry, so it's a very productive area. So the fisheries are, quite substantial. And so within our assessment, the first stage was to assess which of these commercial species have either a period of their life that's resident in kelp forest, so directly reliant on either the shelter or the food that's available within kelp to survive. And so there's a few that are directly reliant on that. And then also, if there was any fisheries which had a spawning period or larval period within the kelp as well. So if they met either of those two limitations, then we put them into our analysis and then left the other ones out. So while other ones might be sort of more indirectly, through a food web related, we went for those ones that we could actually just for sure put within kelp systems for either of those qualifications. And so once we had those, I think it's 6 groups that were meeting them, we then looked at how much total catch in tons on average was caught of those species over a 3-year period, and the value again averaged over that period for how much they cost to export in megatons. And then finally, once we have those values, we can equate that into the total harvest. So we've applied this, so the total fisheries. So while there may be some variation, I guess, in the amount that's directly associated with, we've assumed that all of these species are directly relying on it. So if you had no kelp, you would not have these fisheries, essentially. So we've taken their total harvest value and their license revenue to the Falklands Islands government, and use that to calculate the total value. And so that's 126,000 pounds annually, that's directly related to these fisheries. So yeah, things like squid, scallop, and a number of finfish species that are in this area. And then the final service that we looked at was kelp alginate extraction. So a number of places around the world. So if you look at the map in the bottom corner here, we have different kelp species, and each of these are exploited to some extent for the alginate. So this is a chemical that you can get from kelp species. And so this chemical is used within textile and food industry. So it's quite a valuable product from these natural sources. And so this kind of industry, I guess, started around, I think it was in the 50s, started up in Scotland, but then sort of spread around to areas where you have these large giant kelp species. So such as the US has a large extraction industry, South Africa and Australia. And then areas like Chile has a fairly significant or growing industry in the export of this alginate from natural sources. And so we have the same species as Chile, so Macrocystis and Lawsonia, that can be extracted using this sort of, I suppose similar to if you were farming, you're sort of cropping the top off of these kelp species and then processing it within these large vessels. And so back in 70s and 80s, there was a proposal for starting up a kelp alginate industry within the Falklands due to the large amount of healthy kelp that was situated there. And that didn't go ahead for a number of reasons. I can't remember the specifics about it, but it wasn't viable at that period due to, I think, the large-scale recessions that were happening. But when they put the proposal in, the kelp harvest minimum amount that they were looking to extract that we thought was viable in the long term was this 350,000 tons in wet weight of kelp. And so that's roughly 5% of the Falklands area that would be impacted within this scheme. And so while it didn't go ahead, this kind of it is a feasible industry, and we were looking at it as a kind of non-use value of what it would be worth if it were to be exploited in this area, and if it were to be developed into the future, because this industry is getting more valuable. And so the equivalent dry weight of that is approximately 70,000. So once you've taken it out of the water and dried it into its most basic component. And that value for the dry weight is around £917 per tonne of kelp, based on values from Chile. And if you equate that to the 350,000 tonnes, it's a non-use revenue that could come from the Falklands per year of £64.19 million. It's quite a significant amount of money. And so collectively, we essentially looked at these 5 different services, but there are other services that we didn't look into because we didn't have the correct amount of data available within this study period. And so in terms of storm protection, as I mentioned right back at the start, in the Falklands, this is probably not significant because there's very low population, primarily focused, most of the people live in Stanley, which is a fairly naturally protected harbour area. And so while this probably isn't very valuable for the Falklands, in other areas, such as California or, the tip of South Africa, this value would be quite high. So where you have these large storms coming into these coastal areas, protecting naturally those kind of coastal regions is a significant contribution, stopping the need for built barriers or repayments from damages from storms coming in. While we weren't able to do this because we didn't have the correct storm data, it's likely not significant for the Falklands. In terms of tourism, again, we had broad tourism data, but we didn't have specific data for kelp. So there's a number of reasons why people might come to the Falklands. Some of it is for historic, tourism, but also for natural tourism. So to look at, come and see the penguins and stuff like that. But it's quite difficult to differentiate between the value or the direct value from ecotourism for the industries that are related to it, so from the sort of food and hospitality industries, things like that. To extract that from the surrounding data was difficult, but it might be possible to go more in depth in that for future analysis. And then finally, the cultural aspects. Again, we do have broader detail on the value of coasts to the people of the Falklands. But we weren't able to do this directly for the kelp systems. And I guess the trouble with the Falklands a little bit is the remoteness of it. So you get perhaps a more limited amount of people coming there than a lot of places that do these kind of assessments. And you also get, perhaps because it's a little bit colder, you don't get people diving in. So coral reefs, for instance, are much easier to quantify in this way because you get a lot of people jumping into the lovely water, lots of colours. But yeah, we weren't able to do this for the Falklands in this case. But nonetheless, even though you might not have as many people interacting with this environment, the people that are there may value it. It may be priceless to those that live within this area. And this is always an issue with these kind of assessments of the intrinsic value of having a system, a healthy system that people can interact with. So yeah, with those caveats, just to summarize, global kelp macroalgae habitat is extremely valuable to humanity both now and in the future. So we're seeing the value goes up into the future for its climate regulation and damage mitigation in terms of global climate. So this significant carbon storage element is really useful. It also plays a valuable role in cycling coastal nutrients into more useful resources, so taking out the sort of excess of nitrogen and phosphorus that can accumulate if you don't have these healthy systems. It supports valuable fisheries, commercial and recreational, and the potential alginate industry as well. So both very valuable in their own terms. And there's a range of additional valuable ecosystem services that are associated with the kelp system, which can also be further developed, if we were able to into the future. But they shouldn't be forgotten within this kind of analysis. So I think I'll leave it there, and thanks for listening. And thanks obviously to the funders and collaborators that have helped produce this.